Hey, welcome to Let's Unravel, and I'm your friend Christina. So does any other family have the family lore the way the Kennedys do? Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below, and I'll let you know my thoughts at the end of this episode. So thanks for stopping by. Whether you're a new listener or friend of the show, I just wanted to say welcome. So guys, it's still February. I feel like that was just something that needed to be said. It is still February. We're getting very close to the end. And you know what that means when it's getting close to the end of February? That means a pop culture report is coming your way. Anyways, I don't know. I'm really starting to feel the winter blues, which is kind of funny because I'm going to be honest here, and this might be controversial. I love winter. I really do. I love all the aspects of winter just because I don't like the heat. I am not a summer person, not even a little. I prefer winter for sure. However, I'm having the winter blues. I said it there. It's out there. I've said it. I am having the winter blues. But you know what can cure that? Is if you happen to be watching on YouTube, make sure you're pressing that subscribe button. And if you happen to be listening anywhere else, like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, make sure you're pressing that follow button to stay up to date on all new episodes. Because you know what? You're not going to want to miss what's coming your way. Like I said, a pop culture report is on the horizons. Now, if you happen to want to get involved in our Let's Unravel community, we do have a Facebook page at Let's Unravel Podcast. If you want to see short clips of the show, make sure you're heading over to TikTok and Instagram at Let's Unravel Pod. Now, I'm so glad that you appreciated that little transition of going from the winter blues to just, pressing that thumbs up and subscribe button. But anyways, this has been a very wild and crazy month, thinking about Eric Danes. He has just recently passed away. And Eric Danes, he played Mark Sloan on Grey's Anatomy, aka Nick Steamy. It's really weird when you start to see these actors that have become these beloved characters. I remember in high school, I loved Grey's Anatomy. Don't get me wrong, I still like a good Grey's Anatomy episode. But you know what? Grey's Anatomy, they were in their prime when I was in high school. And so, McSteamy, everybody was talking about McSteamy. It was all the rage. And when Mark Sloan and Lexi Gray died, which, spoiler, too late, but spoiler, when they died in Grey's Anatomy, that broke my heart. It definitely did. They were my favorite character, my favorite couples. There you go. Anyways, let's get into something so much more important. Now, if you haven't heard about Love Story, the new series that is following the relationship of John F. Kennedy Jr. and Carolyn Bessette, I think you might just be living under a rock. So I think it's time that we talk about the woman who not only charmed the most eligible bachelor, John F. Kennedy Jr., but yet somehow charmed the world all in the same process. Yeah. So you can't deny, even after 26, almost 27 years after this couple's tragic death, the world is still buzzing about them. I mean, the Kennedys is the closest thing America has ever had to a royal family. We have seen, honestly, the American public had seen so much of John F. Kennedy Jr.'s entire life from beginning to his untimely death that it really struck a chord. They called him America's son. Now, Love Story is a series all about their relationship, and it was produced by Ryan Murphy. This will be important to remember, so I want you to recognize this now. But the show was inspired or pulled some inspiration from the memoir, Once Upon a Time, The Captivating Life of Carolyn Bessette-Kennedy. So like previously mentioned, Love Story. It is a series on the beginning and the end of the famous relationship of John F. Kennedy Jr. and Carolyn Bessette. And this cast has been fantastic for the show, and I have watched all of the episodes so far. And what I can say is Naomi Watts as Jackie Kennedy, I think that was a perfect fit. I never knew I needed Naomi Watts as Jackie Kennedy until seeing her performance. So the first 3 episodes, that is really where we're getting most of Naomi Watts and her performance. And I will talk about later in this episode, there was one performance that she gave in the 3rd episode, and it's on Jackie Kennedy's deathbed, that I think was the most brilliant performance out of all 3 episodes, just with Naomi Watts in it, because it brings such a foreshadowing of not only what Carolyn Bessette is going to be going through, but also really shows everything that Jackie Kennedy lived through. Now, some of the other amazing actors on this cast is Grace Gummer. She plays Caroline Kennedy, the sister to JFK Jr. She has been in other movies such as Larry Crown in the Springsteen movie. I feel like she has a very recognizable face. I saw her and I was like, oh, I'm sure I've seen her in other things. She has one of those faces. So our leading lady in this series that plays Carolyn is none other than Sarah Pidgeon. Now, she has been in a few other projects, but mostly I would say this is really her breakout role. This is going to be the role that she is known for. And let's not forget our leading man, John F. Kennedy Jr. himself is none other than Paul Anthony Kelly. Now, what's so exciting about Paul Anthony Kelly is he is a newcomer to Hollywood, to film itself. From what I've heard and from what I gather, he's only really been in a play. So he is a full-on newcomer, and he has been making quite a stir just through social media and honestly everywhere he goes. I mean, he looks like 90s Hollywood. I think that's the best way to say. Some people are saying he's like the perfect mashup of like Richard Gere and, just all these others. And it's just, he has a very complimentary look to John F. Kennedy Jr. Now, obviously, they're not identical, but the resemblance is definitely there. And then we look at Sarah, and her Carolyn is now, okay, what is so interesting about this casting is, before the show launched, before there was trailers, they were trying to get some buzz around this series going. So they posted a photo online of Carolyn, John F. Kennedy Jr., and the actors who were going to play them. They were all dressed up in their costumes. And the number one criticism that was going around was how bad Carolyn's hair looked, to the point that production made notice that they're like, we have to change Carolyn's hair. Now, one of the most important things we need to know about John F. Kennedy Jr. and Carolyn Bessette, which I'm pretty sure, well, like I said, once again, you'd be living under a rock. They are fashion icons. They are obviously two very beautiful individuals, along with very ambitious and very well-accomplished individuals, but their look is iconic. That is something that has stood the test of time in the last, about 27 years, is their style has become timeless and their looks have become iconic. And so this is why it was so important for them to nail Carolyn's hair color, because it was probably one of the most striking features about her. Now, let's not forget, she's got amazing blue eyes. She has a very distinct look to her. And so, messing up that hair color, it would totally drag down the entire premise of the show. But what's been so interesting is with Paul Anthony Kelly, he is our John F. Kennedy Jr., is people have been loving him in the show so much, they're making petitions about James Gunn, James Gunn, the director of Superman and now the new Supergirl movie that'll be coming out shortly. They are petitioning that Paul should be the new Batman in James Gunn's Superman universe, which, you know what? I'm not mad about it, because if you think about JFK Jr., I mean, he really is the real life version of Batman. He comes from a wealthy family. His father dies when he's young. Now, granted, his mother was still around, but really, I'm like, you know what? I mean, this whole love story series could really be his auditioning to become the next Batman. And I just have to say, I love when the internet starts casting projects and they're like, this is who the ideal person is. I feel like at some point in time, we should let the public make some suggestions about casting. I know typically in Hollywood fashion, it would be like, no. We tell the public what they want. But you know what? We're living in a new day and age. People know what they want, and people are able to see that Paul could be a great Batman. And so anyways, but one of the most interesting things, so there's a lot of things to discuss about Love Story, the series, and that is what this entire episode is going to be all about. It's going to be talking about really the family lore of the Kennedys, along with the social pressures and how Carolyn fits into all of that. But most importantly, I think what is so universal about this story, so obviously not many people can relate to JFK Jr.'s life, because unless you grow up in the public spotlight, you really have no concept of understanding about it whatsoever. But what people really do resonate with is Carolyn Bessette's story. She is an ordinary girl, and yet somehow she landed the most eligible bachelor. She landed a Kennedy. And what's also so intriguing about this whole story is everybody has a family lore. Everybody has a family history. And John F. Kennedy's family, way before social media ever became a thing, his family was front and center to it all. So in a way, JFK Jr. has almost been living in this world of like social media, even though it wasn't social media, it was paparazzis and magazines and news headlines. But in a lot of ways, his life was so documented, because obviously being in the public light, but it was almost as documented as social media. It might not have been from his perspective. But then again, one of the most interesting things that we learn throughout this love story series is we see how much Jackie Kennedy played a part in the remembrance of his father, John F. Kennedy. And that is something to take note of through this whole series. Now, so much of this series, like I said, a lot of it was inspired from the memoir about Carolyn Bessette. A lot of it was pulled from other places as well. I mean, there's so much documentation. There's so many written accounts about JFK Jr., but there's not as much written about Carolyn Bessette. And that is something that I find to be really intriguing fascinating because in this whole setup of the series, we get to really see the personality, or not even the personality, but we really get to see the intrigue, the allure of Carolyn Bessette. As much as everyone's like, she's an ordinary girl, she's really not. You see, she might be an ambitious girl, and some people might say, you know what, she was in the right place at the right time. But in order for her to have pulled a John F. Kennedy Jr., this girl had to have a lot of brains. There had to be more going on. And that is something that you start to see in the show. She didn't just get lucky. She didn't just play him the right way. If anything, she was the real deal. And I think one of the best ways to see this is really by looking at her wardrobe. So obviously, you know what, JFK Jr., Carolyn Bessette, they have been known for their style. That is just synonymous with who they are. Their style, they've been style icons. They were a power couple. To look at Carolyn's whole wardrobe or aesthetic, she's very well put together. She's timeless. And this is something where I always like to believe the way that you dress, it does somehow reflect what is going on the inside. Now, granted, we know that she was in PR, she was a publicist, worked at Calvin Klein. So we know her clothing and the way it fit her and everything like that was very important. But you have to remember, even when we look at actresses, even when we go back to the 90s, people have such drastic styles all the time. And yet she leaned into being timeless. And I think this really has to go back to showing where her personality was within all of this, that it was she knew exactly what she wanted, and I think that was part of the allure of who she was. And after doing a lot of research and looking into both Carolyn and to John, something that is so interesting about John is even though he has been in the public light, even though he knows so much about him is just known, what is so interesting is there's a lot of deep questions to him as an individual. I mean, like I said, you look at this series, and one of the most important things we have to notice about this series is yes, these are based on true events, but there is still fiction to this. There is a lot of speculation of how we think these people would respond because once again, we don't actually know these people. And of course, I've been seeing so many different TikToks of people's perception on the series, people that maybe knew who John and Carolyn were, or maybe just, you know, someone like myself who's just watching the show for the first time. But there was one girl, and I tried to find what podcast she was on and I couldn't find it. But this one, I believe she was like a journalist or something. She knew who Carolyn and John were. She happened to, like, she had met them a couple times and someone had asked her, oh, are you going to watch Love Story? And she goes, no. I don't want to taint the memory I have of them with this show's interpretation of them. So I thought that was a really interesting way at looking at this because truth be told is if I knew Carolyn and John, would you really want to watch a show that's trying to depict who they were, or would you want to hold on to what you knew to be true? So going back to just the show itself. So obviously this is talking about the relationship of John and Carolyn from the beginning to the untimely end. But something that we're not talking about a lot is how much New York City is more than just the background to this love story. It's actually become a main character in this show, at least in my interpretation. Because what we're seeing so much throughout this show is that John was really a part of this city. It was like this was his city. And in a way, it gave him the ability to feel like a normal guy, even though he was probably the most well-known guy in the world. But one of my favorite things that this show does is we're seeing so much of New York City, what it was like in the 90s, anything from magazine covers to ads all over New York City to running in the park, Central Park, all these things. But once again, we are getting to the point in the show where it even goes back to different song references about New York City, where it's the concrete jungle. And we think about that, where it's like John felt like he was at home in New York City. Carolyn, this was her home too. But then at some point in time, it stops feeling like home and it starts to feel like an invasion of privacy because you've just become the power couple that the world wants to obsess over. And that is something where, once again, with being in New York, this is where I feel like New York becomes like a main character in their story, that it's like no matter where they go within New York, there are always paparazzis following them, where her life used to be so simple, it used to be so mundane, and then all of a sudden overnight, everything changes, all because of the other person in her life. And so in this instance, this is where it's almost like you could see New York being this character where it's like this very subtle, loving, and dear, and all of a sudden it's like overnight New York becomes the villain, because this is where everything becomes so tumultuous. So in some of the ways this show is doing things so right is it's really bringing you back to the 90s. It's doing it so effortless from the way they're filming the show. And one of my favorite things this show is doing is it has to do with the cinematography. It's the coloring, it's the lighting, it's so many things. Honestly, it's really giving that rom-com feel of, like, if you think about movies that came out in like the late 80s, early 90s, like the rom-coms when Harry Met Sally, in those movies, you're seeing that displayed within the cinematography of this show. That is why you are feeling so much like you're like, wow, I feel like I'm really like back in the 90s, like, or I wish I was living in the 90s, like all these different things. And so the way this show is going about turning this whole series, it's feeling like it's almost like a time machine back to the 90s. It's making it seem as though the 90s in New York were the best times because it was before social media. JFK Jr. was riding his bike everywhere, and Carolyn Bessette was working at Calvin Klein. And so this is where I say once again, where New York City has become this main character within their love story, because this is where we're starting to see that it's like we couldn't have had John and Carolyn if we didn't have New York City. So this is where I think the show is doing a beautiful job on incorporating how important New York is to their love story. Now, a massive focal point about this show is obviously the evolving relationship between John and Carolyn. But the show starts out really showing what the beginning of the end looks like for this couple. So we're kind of doing like a future to a backwards time jump of seeing the ending and then going back to live through the beginning with just the way the first episode is set up. So often in the way a lot of stories are portrayed with couples being within the public spotlight is it's almost like once they start to experience the public spotlight, that's when all of a sudden they're like, oh, I don't like it so much. But with Carolyn, you don't see that. You see from the very beginning, she is very reluctant to want to be in the public spotlight. That is not something she's interested in. It's not one of the appeals of dating John. If anything, it's probably one of the biggest negatives that you're seeing is how public her life is going to be. So just like how the show has done so many things right, I think one of the biggest downfalls of this show is as we are learning about the character of John and Carolyn, we are easily seeing how these two people both craved normalcy. And that was something they were never going to have the luxury of. Never. Now, obviously, there is a fine line of where you have to realize someone like John, I mean, ultimately, he never got a choice on deciding if he wanted to be in the limelight or not. This was really his legacy, inheritance. This was going to be his life. Whereas when you look at someone like Carolyn, she got to technically choose, do I want to be with someone that is in the limelight? But then again, you know, it kind of goes back to that saying, do you really get to choose who you fall in love with? So this is kind of like a line in the sand of where we start to realize, okay, these were real people. They did not like when their privacy was violated. And then on top of it, this is where we need to go back in time to when we first talked about how this was a Ryan Murphy project. Now, Ryan Murphy has been in hot water for doing all kinds of projects based on real life events and actually getting into some hot water with the, you know, whether it's been family members of the shows he's produced or victims of, once again, shows that he's produced. So to make sense of some of the drama with Ryan Murphy is he has been known not to consult people on these stories and turning them into massive projects and big time series within streaming networks. So an example with Love Story is JFK Jr.'s nephew, Jack Schlossberg, publicly called out Ryan Murphy on Instagram and in interviews for the way Love Story, the John F. Kennedy Jr. and Carolyn Bessette, originally developed as American Love Story, was being made. His criticisms include that the family wasn't consulted about the project and that Murphy was profiting off his uncle's life in a grotesque way by dramatizing it without involvement from the Kennedys. He shared these comments in an Instagram story and social media post rather than a traditional press interview. And so just when you're thinking, okay, you know what, JFK Jr.'s, his nephew's saying something, maybe Ryan Murphy's going to have something a little eloquent to say. Maybe he's going to have some kind words. But then again, you think about Ryan Murphy and like, that's just not the way Ryan Murphy rolls. Let's just put it that way. So instead, later, Ryan Murphy suggests on a podcast that Jack likely didn't remember his uncle well, and he called it an odd choice to be upset about a relative he might not remember. And then, of course, Jack responds again on Instagram, defending his memory of JFK Jr., urging Murphy to say it to my face, which is just, that's hysterical, while reiterating his critique about how the series handles his uncle's legacy. Now, do I think Jack is entitled to his feelings on this? 100%. I really do. Whether he remembers him or not, that is still his family member. But what is so difficult about this is people feel entitled to the Kennedys. It's something you see in the show. It's something that we see in life. People feel entitled to the Kennedys because of the presidency, because of the assassination, because of everything. We've seen their life. The Kennedys, they are the closest thing that America has to a royal family, so we feel entitled to it. Now, Ryan Murphy, on the other hand, once again, what is public information? Is it the nice, cordial thing to reach out to the family to talk about the projects that you're going to do? Absolutely. Did he blatantly disregard other families and victims when he was creating shows like the Jeffrey Dahmer story on Netflix, or when he created the series Monsters, which was about Lyle and Eric Mendez and their story? Or let's even talk about People versus O.J. Simpson. These are three separate projects that he has gotten into hot water with either the family, victims, or somebody. So we have a clear track record. Ryan Murphy does not care and is not going to care about what Jack is saying about JFK Jr. and really anything. Ryan Murphy is really out to tell a story. And honestly, what he is doing is he is trying to find the most tragic stories and he's trying to romanticize them through his idea of storytelling. And so in this instance, when we are learning about JFK Jr. and Carolyn Bessette, we would easily see they would have never wanted this. They would have never wanted this series or project or anything like this to actually make headwaves. Why? Because their entire relationship, there was always this third wheel. It was the public, along with the Kennedy legacy. This is something that we see whether it's in the show or whether you're reading memoirs or anything involving them. You can see this. You can see that John was desperate to build something outside of himself, outside of the Kennedys, and that is why he created the magazine George, because he didn't even want to use his own name. He wanted to have something that was his very own. And you see the exact same thing with Carolyn, where it's like she wants to build her own ambitious career, but once again, she is forever known as someone's wife, which, you know what, is true, but it's also not true, because also in the same way, she did make a name for herself. So to take a step back, before ever watching the series, I knew exactly who JFK Jr. was. I knew of Carolyn. Did I give her any special attention? No. You know of these people because they're part of your history. So naturally, I've always seen like John's style. Like he has such a distinct style for a guy where he never did, in my opinion, he never did anything really crazy with his style. Like it wasn't like he was wearing like crazy patterns or there was nothing wow factor about it. There was a real subtleness to his style, but it did bring quite an edge to him. So like the perfect example is he's wearing a full suit, but then he's wearing a backwards hat. You see the incorporation of a lot of vests. You see how he's hanging his keys off his dress pants. So there's a lot of these like really cool, like subtle streetwear like styles and incorporating it, but still having that high-end luxury look. And you see the same thing with Carolyn, where it's like wearing like darker colors, or she's always wearing very timeless looks to her. So one of the things the show does is they do a great job showcasing Caroline and just the tumultuous relationship she has with like public appearance and all these things. But something that really got me with Carolyn is I was thinking about episode 4, where she's right on the cusp of like her and John are becoming more of a couple. At some point in time, it's going to become public information, and she's starting to have to deal with that and grapple with that. And also, you know who Calvin Klein is, but you're never really kind of thinking about the individual themselves. You start to think of just the brand as a whole. And so seeing Calvin Klein in the series was really interesting too. So when the character Carolyn is having this conversation with Calvin Klein, whether it was a real conversation or it was dramatized, but I think it's so interesting where Carolyn is really starting to have compassion for kind of like the Kate Moss character, where it's like she's not really knowing, where she's like not really handling stardom very well or all the attention. And I think what's so interesting is with Carolyn as an individual, she worked in PR. She was a publicist. She worked around celebrities or high echelon individuals. So in this instance, she's kind of acting like Hannah Montana, where it's like she sees the world these celebrities are in, and she is benefiting from the world of celebrity while she still has her anonymity. But what ends up happening is because she is living a little bit of being in both worlds, she's seeing all of the pros and she's seeing all of the cons. So in my opinion, what makes her even more interesting is really the job that she has, because she's seeing both viewpoints of this potential lifestyle. She's seeing what it's like to be normal, but she's also seeing the reality of celebrities. And so even the example with John, she always knew who John was because, once again, John was synonymous with the times, that it was impossible not to know who JFK Jr. was. Whereas with Carolyn, what is so interesting is you can go onto TikTok right now and people are pulling up old footage from like Calvin Klein fashion shows and they're trying to see if they can find her in the background. It's almost like she saw this all coming before it ever really happened. And also, what I think to be such a cool testament to both of these individuals is really the character that they have at hand, is when you talk to people that knew them, when they recount things that they knew about these people, it's almost every person that talks about this couple, they always seem to have the exact same response, where it's like, with Carolyn, she cared about John. So as much as it's almost like in this show, it's like, oh, she played him, which, you know, there's always that cat and mouse game to dating and different things like that. And you even think about her. Okay, so one of the perfect things I tell people all the time is if you look at someone like a Carolyn Bessette, and it's like she went from a very like normal average life to working at Calvin Klein, starting like in PR, moving to being a publicist and all these things. You have to remember, people that achieve success, there is a reason and there are things you have to be willing to do to get there. So there has to be a certain level of ambition. There has to be a certain level of knowing what the appropriate next steps are, that it's like you don't just so happen to get somewhere accidentally. There's usually very distinct things that need to happen. And it's like you have to be quote unquote cutthroat. So even like when people talk about, okay, what was Carolyn like before John? And it's like, oh, this was the dating advice that she would give, where it's like, don't call him back right away. But ultimately, you look at someone like Carolyn and it goes back to this, she knew how to play the game. It kind of goes back to like when people say, oh, I don't want to deal with office politics. It's life. That is, if there's anything to take away from this series, besides just the tragicness and just the invasion of privacy for people that would have never wanted this series to even exist, it's that in order to achieve the things that you want to achieve, so even with John, when he wanted this magazine, George, there are certain things he needed to do. So it's like if he wanted this magazine to be successful, he did need to be the face of it. Okay, maybe he didn't use the name Kennedy, maybe he used the name George, but you do have to find whatever it is that you're good at, or whatever it is that like you have an advantage of, you do have to capitalize on that. And that is something that you notice with Carolyn. She knew that. She knew how to be, people always called her very guarded. She wasn't cold, which even though that's usually the way people perceive being guarded as being cold, but instead it's like she's very aware of the way that she needs to present. And once again, why would she have such a successful career being in PR? Because she knows of the way that you need to present. And so when we have those things in mind and we think about how it's like, okay, so she worked in PR, she worked with celebrities. You're telling me she didn't know all the pros and the cons of being a celebrity, that no matter how great the exciting things are, that it's like she enjoyed her privacy. And then you even find out that it's like, okay, she had a little bit of a wild past, and you know what? Could have been one of those things, never wanted that to come out, but you know what? It did. And ultimately, when she's able to see both sides of this like double-sided coin, she can very clearly see that as much as you get from fame or the public persona, there are things that are ultimately taken away too. So it was one of those instances, the anonymity was completely shot with having a public relationship. Now, moving back to the original idea I talked about with Naomi Watts, is on her deathbed. So this is in episode 3 of Love Story, is on her deathbed. She is talking about JFK. She's talking about John's father. And so in this scene that I'm referring to, it's about like, I think middle of the episode, she's on her deathbed. She's displaying so much humanity as not only just being a woman, having been a wife, having been a mother, and having been a public figure, because she has a priest with her and she's doing the sinner's prayer where it's like, Lord, I have sinned. And ultimately, she was just saying how she goes, I was so mad at him, meaning John F. Kennedy, for all he put her through, all of the women, but she always protected him. Now, something that I think is so interesting that we can always look at is like, okay, these relationships where it's like, okay, well, you know, the guy physically protects a woman, like whether from danger or whatever the case may be. But we don't always give women the credit that they deserve for the way they protect and they shield their families, their husbands. And I think Jackie Kennedy was a beautiful representation of this, especially the way Naomi Watts played it in the show. Because what we're seeing is Jackie Kennedy protected the image of John F. Kennedy. That is something he couldn't have done even if he wanted to do, even if he wasn't assassinated. This was something she made the conscious decision. And this, in my opinion, is really a foreshadowing of, you can see the same thing with Carolyn Bessette, where if you notice, there's not a lot of documentation of Carolyn Bessette doing interviews, not in the same way John did interviews. And so this is where if you start to look at the dynamic between Jackie and Carolyn, there's a lot of similarities where they're really out to protect the relationship, the dynamic, the public persona of a person more out of the ripple effect more than anything. And that is something where when you see these relationships, done well, and so looking at the relationship of JFK Jr. and Carolyn Bessette, John was able to protect Carolyn in a way of by giving her admiration. It created this charm throughout the world where the world ended up admiring her too. And that's why they were chasing her, because out of his love and protection of her, there became adoration. Whereas out of the love and protection Carolyn bestowed onto John, what we're seeing is she's able to shield and protect a side of his character, because ultimately, when you look at these dynamics, nobody can hurt a man's character quite like his wife can. And it's the same thing with a woman. No one can make a woman look more unappealing than her husband. It's just more of the dynamic. And yet when both of those are done well, it's almost like it can become charismatic to see. So when all of a sudden a man has nothing but adoration for his wife, just like John had nothing but adoration for Carolyn, that is what's still buzzing to this day. Everyone is so curious about her because there was this adoration from John. And yet everyone is so obsessed with John because once again, it's like when you look at Carolyn, there was a respectfulness to him. The respect was she never wanted to talk about it. So even though Jackie Kennedy was the one who was helping people or she was contributing to however JFK's memoirs were being written, there was different ways both of these women contributed something to each man's legacy, but it was on their own terms. And so with Carolyn being a normal average girl, not wanting to vocalize opinions or not even wanting to participate in the publicness of their relationship, she humanized him, where it made it seem as though what happened at home was sacred to them. So in the final topic of this show, I had briefly mentioned it in the beginning of this episode, but what is so interesting about the whole Kennedy dynamic of everything is everyone has a family story. Everyone has their family lore. And obviously the Kennedys is public, so everyone gets to participate in understanding what is going on in their family dynamic. But it always comes back to that first time you hear all about the good, the bad, the ugly of the whole family dynamic. And what this show also does is it shows kind of like the messiness or the hardness of being an outsider trying to come into the inner circle of a whole new family dynamic. Now, once again, when we look at Love Story, this is a whole different ballpark altogether because there's such nuance to it when there's money and power and everything else to it, but so many of the emotions are the same way. Have you ever sat at a table, whether it was at a partner's house or anywhere in general, where it's like you are the outsider and now you have been brought to the table, you have been brought to the inner circle, and you're sitting there and you just keep thinking like, how the heck did I get here? And now you're starting to hear all the family secrets and everything is coming out. And it's almost as if you keep looking over your shoulder like, when are they going to realize like I don't belong here? And that is something that I think is so universal because when you look at your partner at the table and you look around, it's like, oh my God, this is what they've been groomed for. This is what their life is. Even when you're looking at your own family dynamic and you're like, oh my God, this is crazy. But then when you look at it kind of like on the steroids or on the just the craziness of the Kennedys, that's where it's, once again, families. They have opinions on things. Everybody has an opinion on everything. And that was even another instance within the show that I thought was so interesting is how Jackie Kennedy and Caroline were both like, stop bringing home actresses. But once again, when you think about JFK Jr., I mean, the list of actresses that he dated, you know, obviously in the show, they talk about Daryl Hannah, and then you find out about some of the other ones like Sarah Jessica Parker and Madonna and so on and so forth. But these are instances where, once again, you're the outsider. You come in and you think about it. There's so many times in life where it's like you start dating someone new, and even if that's the person you end up marrying, everyone has a past. So whether it's the family history, whether it's the individual person's past, whatever the case is, but then to see that it's almost like, oh my God, your past is about people I know of. So like, you know, the celebrities, Sarah Jessica Parker, Madonna, but it's just, there's such an awe to it. I don't know if I would say awe, but there's such an intriguement to it where you're just like, okay. And then once again, you can find yourself even in the situation where it's like, I don't even know how this person ended up picking me. So ultimately, after watching Love Story, I couldn't help but just keep seeing so many parallels to just, life of just a normal person, learning things about your family, about stepping into other people's world. And then even looking at someone like John, even when he's trying to create the magazine George, and it's like even JFK Jr. was dying to have something of his own. I mean, he had the world at his fingertips, and yet he was dying to make a name outside of the Kennedy name. And I think that is something that we're really overlooking. We're looking at the love story aspect of it. Yes, that's true. We're looking at the styles, and ultimately we're only recognizing them based on the very thing they wanted to keep private. But when we look at this story, we are romanticizing a very tragic story. But because of the timing distance from when all of this took place almost 27 years ago, we're able to romanticize it. We're able to call it love story, when really, when you find out more about their relationship, you start to notice there was a lot of tension, there was a lot of scrutiny. But because of both these people being very beautiful people on the outside, because of them being ambitious, there's this beautiful packaging, and there's these beautiful way of calling it the love story, or he wanted to call it, like Ryan Murphy wanted to call it, the American love story. But the bones of their relationship were riddled with tension. This was something they would not have wanted. And that is something, once again, JFK's nephew, Jack, when it's sort of like, it would have been nice if you consulted the family. Well, would it have been nice because we're keeping the curated tone of what the Kennedys do and all these different things? Yeah, maybe. But also, what you're seeing is there's something so tragic about this story. These people are trapped. Both these individuals are trapped in like this endless hamster wheel of John can't get out of his own way because of his family name, and Carolyn is torn between loving someone and giving up her own anonymity in the process of all of it, and it creates nothing but tension between the two of them. And then you pepper in the untimely death of how they passed away and how it was tragic. So not only did John have to grow up without a father, know that his father was president, know he was assassinated, have to live through the death of his own mother, but then it's like to meet an untimely death in a very tragic way as well, which you can't even imagine what the last few minutes of that could have been like. So ultimately, the whole couple, this whole series is all about a couple who were desperate to want to have something real, wanting to have something normal, wanting to have something sacred between the two of them. And instead, Ryan Murphy decided to create a whole series highlighting every part of their life they would have never wanted highlighted, making them immortal and the topic of a conversation that even 27 years after their untimely death, people are not forgetting about. But I think it's really ironic that for a couple who adored their privacy, they would have been tortured by this series, because even in the series Love Story, it makes a reference from JFK's sister Caroline saying what's owed to the public and what can just be for them or the person. And I think that's a really interesting perspective to look at, is where can the line be drawn, that even in death, there is no rest because you're still being talked about. So anyways, thanks so much for hanging out with me, and thank you for talking all things love story. So if you have any thoughts on the show, drop some comments down below. I'd love to know your perspective. Have you thought any of these things? Have you seen any interviews about people talking about this series? I think it's really interesting. And I will say, I don't think it's the actor's fault. I just think it's a Ryan Murphy fail. This is one of those instances where it's like, where is the line? Where's the line between Hollywood, reality, and everything else between and public domain, Anyways, so I'd love to connect with you more. You can connect with us on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube at Let's Unravel Pod. If you enjoyed this week's show or the podcast show in general, please leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and now Facebook. Your 5-star reviews and comments go a very long way. And also, please don't forget to hit that subscribe or follow button wherever you might listen to stay up to date on all new episodes. We release new episodes every single Thursday, and you are not going to want to miss this. Well, it's that time of the episode that I follow up with my question that I asked earlier. Is there any other family in the world that has as much lore as the Kennedys? Because I can tell you right now, my family does not have that much lore. I think every family has their own interesting history. If there was a family that had an interesting lore to it, it has to be the royal family. Like, I'm telling you, there is just something really, really interesting to the royal family dynamic. And maybe I'm missing a family. So if you know of another family, or just, I don't know, I want the tea, drop some comments down below. Convince me why it wouldn't be the royal family. Tell me if it would be something like someone else or something, give me some insight. But you know what? I think the royal family has a lot of intrigue behind it, especially when it comes to Princess Diana. And I said what I said. I'm not giving any explanation, but if you have thoughts, like I said, drop them in the comments down below. All right. Well, I will talk to you later. Bye.